how much work we have left to do. So I encourage you to look on the website and see the work that we're doing in this regard. And again, I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
I'm Robert Brannon. I'm a social psychologist at Brooklyn College, and it is my responsibility for NOMAS to monitor and study some of the most controversial hot-button issues in our culture today: sex trafficking, the use of women and girls in prostitution, and the continuing struggle to address some of the problems linked to the proliferation of pornography in our culture. Now, it will surprise some people to learn that there is still a feminist movement concerned with the harms of pornography. Most of the media seems to think that this issue was all debated and settled years ago, and that our side lost. And indeed, for those of us concerned about the harmful effects of pornography, it has been a disheartening experience to see what was once a large movement shrivel and largely become invisible today. Mainstream America has in many ways accepted the sensibilities and values of the sex industry, from pole dancing to Brazilian waxing to triple X-rated videos in public libraries, and we are being pornified as a culture, in the words of Paula Paul's book. And yet, many visible social harms that are linked to pornography have continued to grow and become more evident with each passing year. One new emerging issue ironically affects men more frequently than women and girls, who are the usual victims of these harms. Internet pornography addiction has emerged as a new area of clinical work, and there are many men who have lost their careers, their relationships, their lives because of their inability to not indulge in the instant gratification of internet pornography. Other harms are of a different nature. The specific content of certain forms of pornography teaches, particularly to some men, that sexual coercion is sexy and okay, and that women like it. There are indeed some 60 to 80 scientific laboratory studies investigating with random samples of young men the exact effects of different kinds of scenarios. So we are able today to make a much better case than we might have in the past about these harms. And we do believe that as they continue to escalate, this issue will reemerge in American culture. It is not settled and gone forever. It is a complex issue, and there are things that our movement is still grappling with. On our website, we have a list of some unresolved issues within the feminist anti-pornography analysis, such as, is pornography essentially one thing, one phenomenon, as the word would imply, or is it a combination of several different factors with different effects? Is pornography limited to things that are sexually explicit? Can there be things that are sexually explicit that are not pornographic? Should the categories of sex education material and equalitarian respectful erotica be excluded or included in what we think of as pornography? Now, the argument that pornography is speech and therefore protected by the First Amendment has won repeatedly in the U.S. courts and has defeated all efforts to date to in any way limit the harms of pornography. So we are thinking very carefully about how to distinguish that issue from the free speech issues. And there are other challenges. One is that the anti-pornography movement, despite denials, is still viewed by many as a prudish, uptight, anti-erotic group of people. So this issue continues in the process of feminist analysis and critique. Now, at first glance, an issue that it would appear that feminists are having more success with is that of sex trafficking. At first, it seems that the horrors of human sex trafficking around the world have been clearly recognized today, at least in the U.S. It appears, at least, that change for the better is happening. Public opinion seems to be strongly critical of sex trafficking. And the National Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA, has been passed and more recently extended. But a closer look at the realities gives a different and more sobering picture. Now, no one can say with any precision what the volume of sex trafficking is from year to year, but most authorities think that it's going up, not down. And for reasons that are not too hard to figure out, our laws, including the TVPA, seem largely ineffective. That bill had a very fatal flaw when it was passed back in 2000 for the first time, a flaw that made it largely inoperative. While it had some nice general language, actual legal penalties were reserved only if the victim of trafficking could somehow prove in court months or years later under hostile cross-examination that force or fraud or coercion was used to bring them into sex trafficking. So this is a very high hurdle. As a practical matter, although these tactics are used almost universally, proving it in court years later with a lawyer examining you is extremely daunting for a terrified, penniless young woman far away from home. It becomes a ludicrous requirement. And the predictable result is that years after that bill has been passed, there have been very, very few actual convictions for trafficking. In the first 9 years after passage, there were just 196 total cases throughout the United States and a small number of convictions. So articles have actually appeared in the press saying since there's so few convictions for trafficking, this whole issue must have been made up by those crazy feminists, that there's not really much trafficking going on. So that challenge, of course, is a problem to be solved. Now, global sex trafficking of young girls and women, often of color, from poor countries, shipped from Western and from Asian and African and third world nations to wealthy European and Arab countries, is almost exactly the same thing as prostitution. They're really extremely overlapping concepts. And yet, a big difference is that while sex trafficking has a generally bad image in our culture, prostitution has a much more ambivalent sort of image. It's sort of sexy and racy and kicky, some people feel. Most of us think we know a little bit about prostitution, although we've never interviewed or talked to people trapped in this nightmare. And how do we think we know so much about it? Well, we've seen Hollywood movies. It's one of the favorite subjects of Hollywood movies. Almost every major actress has played the role of a prostitute at one time or another. So social scientists have been slow to look at these issues, but have uncovered a number of alarming facts. One of the most poignant is the early age of entry. A question that almost any woman can accurately answer is, at what age did you first enter prostitution? And 5 separate studies in separate cities at different times all came up with the exact same average age, 14. The use of the extent to which women now in prostitution were previously victims of childhood sexual exploitation was another startling discovery of social science research. So I will wrap up my comments. I have, if I had time, I'd talk about a very misleading phrase that you hear a lot of these days, the word sex work. Consider the difference between your reaction to a little girl being used in prostitution versus a sex worker. So a talk I gave on that subject is available here. There's some copies on the edge of the podium. And we also have our NOMAS positions on the issues of prostitution, a 12-page document that addresses a great many things. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Greg White. I am just so truly honored to be here with you at this conference that Barry has put together, and to really have this opportunity to talk with you a little bit about the work that I do in Western New York, which is the 8 counties of Western New York, more specifically in Buffalo. I work at Catholic Charities, and I've been doing social justice work in that community for about 30 years, and it was in the late 1980s that our local domestic violence battered women's program and the criminal and civil justice systems came to Catholic Charities, really requesting us to create a batterer program that would respond to mandated men who came before the criminal and civil justice systems in those 8 counties to create a batterer program that would accept those court-mandated referrals. Moving along a timeline, there were some of us in New York State who began working together in conjunction with the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence and the New York State Coalition to really look at what batterer programs were achieving and not achieving, as well as create a model that was really ethical and responsible and doable. When the current kind of soundbite at the time that began to emerge is that batterer programs don't work. 30 years ago, when batterer programs started in the United States of America, they were created to stop men from abusing their intimate female partners. That was their goal. And it became clear over the years that batterer programs were not achieving that goal. Many batterer programs have not come to that conclusion to this day, nor have they made that testimony. Thus, batterer programs in communities that don't make that testimony become a smokescreen for that community. The intuitive thought is that batterer programs, and if we have one in our community, that somehow victims of men's violence will become safer, including their children. It's a very serious notion, a very serious problem. So some of us here in New York State really decided, at the direction of our local domestic violence programs, battered women's advocates, were charged with creating a model that was really ethical and responsible, and finding out ways in which we could create a model that did work, that was doable within working in conjunction with the criminal and civil justice systems in our communities. That evolution led us to what we now refer to as the New York model for batterer programs. It was really because of ongoing communication, conversations, and taking leadership from battered women's advocates at our local level, at the state level, and at the national level that created this evolution to create this New York model for batterer programs. So in principle, every single thing that we do in a New York model batterer program, from its practices, its policies, its procedures, are all, we seek the input from our local domestic violence programs as well as the state level programs. And our goal is to never undermine the work of the battered women's movement in this country. So the New York Model Batterer Program is a service to criminal and civil justice courts, as well as child protective services, as well as probation, as well as parole, as a mechanism, as a way to hold men accountable who come before those agents of the courts or the courts in a fair and reasonable way. So it affords the courts a mechanism to see if men will really take seriously their order to attend the program. And if men do not take that order seriously, the courts immediately will know and be able to respond to that non-compliance of an order to attend by imposing additional sanctions. So this is about holding men accountable in reasonable and doable ways as a system response that is imposed for men who come before the criminal justice system in our communities. Men attend a weekly 1.5-hour session on domestic violence information that we would offer to anyone. That is domestic violence information that comes from the battered women's movement in this country, including all of what you've heard up here today from this panel. The New York Model for Batterer Programs is endorsed by the New York State Council, or New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, certainly by the NOMAS panel, and the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. So here's a little advertisement. If you want to learn more about the New York Model for Batterer Program, we are doing a workshop tomorrow afternoon. I'd like to invite all of you to hear more about this. Thank you so much for your time.
Good morning. I was thinking, as all my colleagues have spoken about the era when I first found NOMAS, I discovered the Changing Men magazine long before I heard about NOMAS and subscribed to it. So I kind of had a little head start as I was doing my work around helping to organize domestic violence and rape crisis programs way back from the perspective of radical feminism. So I don't even know now, many years ago, my good friend Phyllis kind of dragged me kicking and screaming to a NOMAS conference in Chicago, and I was hooked from then on. So I eventually joined the Leadership Council and have been engaged with NOMAS for a very long time. And I must tell you that as a radical feminist, working with lots of other so-called feminist organizations, I find the National Organization for Men Against Sexism to operate in a more feminist way than any other organization I've ever been involved with. And I think that's in some ways a sad commentary, but it's just the truth because of the real accountability of the people who do this work together as NOMAS to just always hear from survivors, oppressed groups, and do the work within all of the understandings we can gain about oppression and the ways that it operates. And I would say too, you've heard us each speak about different things, and in spite of that, well, in addition to that, we all are allied with one another and address these topics together. I'm part of the Ending Men's Violence Task Group, which was kind of a natural fit for me as a person working in domestic violence for so many years. And the Ending Men's Violence Task Group has put out position papers and done a lot of work that's allied with much of the other information you've heard today. We hear about Jack Straighten and his fabulous papers. He's been very involved in helping us with this particular piece, the Ending Men's Violence Task Group. He's put out papers about fathers' rights and about some of the misinformation that's spread everywhere about women are more violent than men and men are more abused than women, and some of this other really faulty, misleading, and totally dishonest information that's been put out. And Jack Straighten and Michael Kimmel have both written about that topic quite well, and I think you'll see references to that on our website. Through the Ending Men's Violence task group and all the other work we do, NOMAS has always been pretty allied with many feminist domestic violence programs and supportive of the New York model, which also many feminist domestic violence programs support. Listening at this conference for me, just as a personal sense and as a survivor, has been a bit difficult. It's triggered a lot of stuff as a survivor myself and a mom of children who've been so severely affected. And I think we have to sometimes say the difficult things that people don't want to hear, like our systems in this culture serve the patriarchy, and that's been so demonstrated by the stories we hear at this conference about children being handed over again and again and again to abusers. And, you know, we can't always walk up to the judge and say, you know, you're here serving patriarchy. It doesn't quite correct it. But I think we have to keep the broad analysis in our minds to understand why things operate the way they do. I would just mention also, in looking on our website, look at some of the products that are produced by NOMAS, some of the toolkits. Our reproductive coercion toolkit was the result of a lot of work that we did together with NCADV and with the Feminist Women's Health Center, along with Up the River Consortium and funding through that group. We're pretty broad-based. In many ways, the work on anti-racism is close to my heart and dear to my heart, and Phyllis expresses it so beautifully. I could just go on, but I want to leave time for questions and answers, so I'm going to stop, but thank you all so much for being here.
Okay, I just want to make a couple of very quick announcements. The NOMAS Council is going to be meeting. We're going to meet during the lunchtime now, during the dinner time, and tomorrow, right after the conference ends. I expect we're going to be meeting upstairs in one of the breakout rooms. These meetings are open, and you're most welcome to come for any part of it or all of it. We'd be happy for you to see, you know, how we conducted the meeting, what we discussed, and all of that. Mo, do you have any announcements?
Just about lunch.
Okay. Thank you for your attention, and we will be here to talk with you throughout the rest of the conference.
Gary, if you want, you can take 5 minutes for questions.
5 minutes for questions? Okay. Kathy.
Yes, I have a comment for, I think it's Mr. Green, the professor that talked about sex slavery. Is that Robert? Yes. I just wanted to note that we just had a conference at George Washington University last fall. We call it a mini BMCC, but it doesn't approach this, where it was about sexual slavery. And Gypsy Marie Roberts has written a book called The NOMAS Righteous Warriors. You might want to put in your library. I also wanted to say that it's not just little girls, but it's little boys that are being raped. I'm the mother of a child that is raped by my husband, who was raped by priests. And the explosion in kiddie porn is due to the fact that courts are giving the child victims to the perpetrators, the molesters, the pedophiles. Now, I didn't hear you mention that, so you might want to put that as a tool in your tool belt. That's all I wanted to say about little boys, not just little girls. I understand that pedophiles are made to give 21 pictures of their own children, and I know he's photographing our babies since infancy in sexual positions, because he has to give these 20 pictures to the other child pornographers so that they have the goods on each other. It's like mutually assured destruction. And now they know that he's not going to turn them in because they'll turn him in. And this is where the kiddie porn explosion is coming in. Anyway, Gypsy Marie Roberts' book, they're known as Righteous Warriors, and Connie gave an excellent lecture at that.
Thank you for adding that point. You're You're entirely right, and in our positions on our position paper, we have a section on the use of poison in prostitution, which is certainly a growing problem.
I just want to say it's wonderful to have men involved in this and men trying to make a difference for us because we need the good men. Right? That's right.
I just had a really quick question. Several of you touched on the sexism and the isms of this. How does one go about countering the arguments from the other side that we hate men, or a person who is gay saying, fighting against straight people, and the straight people saying you hate straight people, or you hate this person, or you hate that person? How do we say, no, we don't hate men, because we don't?
I always say we hate patriarchy. We don't hate men. We hate white supremacy, say people of color, not white people. It's the institution that we're fighting against. That's how we respond from here. Because that is a way to silence us. We all know that as women. We just get silenced. If you hate men, then nobody needs to listen to you. Try patriarchy.
Conference on homelessness was showing that the poverty linked to homelessness, and one man I met walking around the country, I think it's houseless.org or something, it's another ism. And in Connecticut, we're having a plan to end homelessness, and I think the president is saying this too. We have to give everybody a home that's more secure and not make them earn it so much, so that particularly pregnant women and people at risk, I met somebody in the subway who's in a wheelchair and he'll be homeless again, that we need to put that dignity there, and like the Quincy Solutions and other things, it will save so much money. That's what it was about. The bottom line was like $200,000 to let them go to these shelters and have the extreme services, whereas if they had secure housing. And I'd also like to pitch that the pregnancy support needs to be there, because if the human brain doesn't develop appropriately, the little children come out so compromised. And so again, to give women the right support during their pregnancy so they can grow a healthy child. And those little years, I feel like babies are never really discussed, and supported. So thank you for all you're doing. And if you want to speak, fine.
In the back.
Hi. There's too many intelligent minds in this room for this not to have been a conversation. I'm just not hearing it yet, and I feel compelled to mention it. That this is about equality, and in the Constitution, person means household, which is why our children continue to be sold to the highest bidder. If a woman had a household is not even independent, regardless of her income, and the wage gap. We don't have parallel fronts going after equality, which touches on all these other issues, and closing our income gap. Then everybody else is going to be property who's not a white male who crafted constitutions 200 plus years ago.
Last question, then maybe.
One last
Yeah,
one. Okay.
I'm a behavioral social scientist, and I'm also a target by a sibling of domestic violence, and he's gotten me through 4 states. So I've been researching this extensively, and everything you said here, the issues are the driver of all this. And number 1 is the sexualization of women and children. That the men have become so, addicted. And that's the worst addiction there is. And a man named Patrick Truman created an organization called Porn Harms in Washington, D.C. And now it's called Exploiting Women and Children. And they're making huge grounds. So Google that name, Porn Harms, Google, some of the hotels to stop running porn, the military. They're bringing the kind of awareness that you want, and we all have to work together.